Good morning. So this is actually the future of research of being decentralized. So we actually have 4 panel speakers that are going to be dialing in remote while the rest of us are live. And that's actually been the way we've been living in the last 2 years. So we thank you guys for joining us here. We also have live broadcasting. If you'd like to take a seat. So we're going to get started. The topic of our conversation is that the future of decentralization has changed the way we're modernizing medicine. And I'm so privileged to be here today, and I thank the Galien Foundation for hosting a phenomenal week of innovation. The number of webinars, broadcasting, talking about topics that are not just the future of the now, and it really has been possible by the collaboration of industry, of scientists, of the regulatory agencies, CROs, sponsors, all coming together to try to understand how do we create an opportunity for ubiquitous access to care, diversification, and now we're looking to turn ahead. What is the modernization of care for patients? So I'm very pleased to introduce the panelists that we have today. A slide on that if you guys want to bring it up. So with us I have Dr. Michelle Longmire, CEO of Medable.
Thank you, Marianne.
Tony Kalapsis from CVS Health. And if you could see our panelists, so we have Dr. Sebastian Guth, President of Bayer, Dr. Andy Plume, President of Takeda, Ms. Christine Duran, the Chief Health Officer at AZ, and Mr. Robert Califf, Head of Policy at Verily. So we're talking about a topic that's near and dear to my heart, recognizing that digital and transformation has come together with decentralized. And so what we're going to be talking about in the next hour is we're going to define what is decentralization. We're going to talk about what's happened from the pandemic, why it's important, and what's the future. And so I'll first start off with Michelle, really defining what has been decentralized trials for the industry, and how is Medable making an impact to create more ubiquitous access to care.
Sure. So thank you, everyone, for really getting together to talk about just such an important concept, which is how do we really innovate in the critical work of making new medicines. My background, I'm a physician scientist. I trained at Stanford in dermatology, and I was leading rare disease research, specifically looking at extremely rare cohorts of patients living with systemic sclerosis, a condition that had a 90% fatality rate before we really understood how to treat the disease largely with repurposed medicines initially. In centralized research and in centralized care, and here I'm at Stanford, one of the few people really researching and treating patients with this condition. And in centralized care, we're limiting that to the patients who live in that immediate area. So there are important innovations, there are important treatment options, but it's very limited in terms of who has access. I mean, at Stanford, we were treating patients who were literally coming from all over the world. But as you could imagine, the patients who can make that journey, it's a very, very small number of patients. And as I looked at that problem, I started to think, how do we really enable access? We can use technology to access almost anything in the world. As we've seen this year, with the utilization of Zoom, suddenly we had access to our teams and our partners all over the world and instantaneously. And living in Silicon Valley, I had seen how access through technology had really transformed every industry really outside of healthcare. And I thought there was a big opportunity to ultimately build a company that could provide access both to clinical care and research for anyone in the world, so that patients didn't need to travel many hundreds or thousands of miles, and more importantly even, that every single person who was suffering from an illness would have access to cutting-edge therapies that were in clinical research and to the very, very best and most knowledgeable clinicians. So I started Medable in roughly 2015, and since that time have been working with just an incredible team across industries to build a platform that could truly provide global access to clinical research, with this idea that decentralization, moving it from a site-focused world, a clinician-focused world, to a world which is all about where people live and where people, actually need to have the access point for clinical care and clinical research. So, we were very early to the concept, and I think biopharma was excited. We were presenting an important path forward, but it wasn't entirely relevant until the pandemic. And in the pandemic, this approach went from an edge case to a main case, as all over the world, clinical trials that had been underway and clinical trials that were planned suddenly really needed a new path for access for patients. And when we look forward, we have evidence now and a tremendous amount of know-how to how to provide this access at a scale we've never actually been able to do before. So in my mind, decentralization is really moving research from a very limited entry point to a ubiquitous entry point where every patient who's living with a condition and every person who needs access to, in many cases, life-saving therapies can really gain that access and that care. I think it also really importantly opens the door to the advancement of science through digital. Prior to the pandemic and prior to decentralized, many of our kind of, I'd say, advances using digital were largely taking paper and making them a digital process. We live in an era of exponential medicine. I think we need to challenge ourselves to think about how digital should be transforming the scientific backbone of how we do the clinical research. And I think we're starting to see new methods, new models emerge, and that is also extremely exciting. So I think decentralization is really all about people and patients and a model that really works for the entire world.
Thank you. I mean, what's extraordinary about, Michelle, what you just mentioned is that, it's not just about technology. It's about creating the fact that we've been invited for our patients basically have opened the door, right? And now clinical research is in their home. And now we have this opportunity that trust and that transparency and that convenience now allows us to create a partnership with patients. And so I think this is like a revolutionary opportunity for all of us to think about how this is now modernizing the way medicine should be handled, right? With the care and with the intimacy of now understanding how patients want to be treated, how they're being consented, how they're being informed, and how they're being engaged. And so thank you for kicking us off, Michelle. I mean, one of the things that I think has changed is through the pandemic is the digital transformation, but also we've recognized policy has changed. And so if I can ask Dr. Rob Califf to talk about the fact that, policy has changed. The U.S. FDA 21st Century Cure Act has now included the need for patient experience and real-world data. And so, Rob, if you can comment on some of the things that we know that you're wildly passionate about in terms of evidence-based research and how that's so important in terms of our movement in decentralized trials.
Yeah, thanks, and it's good to be here with you guys. Sorry, I'm not in New York, but 21st Century Cure has happened on my watch when I was FDA commissioner, and there's a lot built into it that people didn't recognize at first. That hopefully is setting a pathway that I feel like was a little bit futuristic in terms of no one knew when a pandemic would hit, but we were hit with this terrible pandemic, and a lot of the clauses in 21st Century Cures are intended to spur on real-world evidence, real-world data, direct communication with patients, and a broader access to clinical research, all of which you brought on. So those pathways are there. There's still a lot of policy work to do. And just because I'm typically a contrarian, I do hope this panel will address what I think is, if I had a theme this year, other than, thank goodness we are getting through the pandemic and we're learning a lot and hopefully we'll fix a lot of things, it's we have to square our rhetoric with the facts. And so I completely agree that decentralization and digitization should be the entree to equity and fairness and greater access. The fact is, right now the data is showing the opposite, that digitization is paving the way for people who are already highly educated, already activated, already involved, and it's leaving behind the people who probably would benefit the most. And so as we look at this, I'm gung-ho 100% for it, but there's something we're not doing right here that we need to fix. And, I sort of look forward to the panel's views on this.
Yeah, thank you. And so I'm going to turn it over to next, really talking about the results of actually using decentralized trials. And I will turn it to Ms. Christina Durant, who, as a Chief Health Officer, has actually embraced using technologies across therapeutic areas in terms of outcomes. So Christina, can you share with us some of the examples of, now that we've had access to decentralized trials and leveraging some of the changes in regulatory standards, how you're able to use that in terms of the trials that you've seen?
Thank you, and hi, everyone. So in AstraZeneca, we've been working with patients on how to improve clinical trials for over a few years and piloting many different solutions, and also looking at how much of the data that historically was collected at sites could be collected through clinical devices from patients' home. And we did analyze over 90 protocols over all the therapeutic areas that AstraZeneca plays, and compared to clinical validated devices. And we found that historically 90% of that data had to be collected at the hospital site, but actually with new technologies, 70% of all that data could be collected from home. So we moved from piloting, and we had plenty of pilots over 5 years. I think pharma is very good at piloting. We decided that we had to move to move it across R&D to do it at scale. And so we wanted, this year, for example, we wanted 90% of programs to incorporate digital health strategy in terms of how we could do it in a different way. What we've seen, I think there is a number of studies that can be fully decentralized. There is a number of studies that can be hybrid. We call it hybrid. So we can reduce the number of visits to what is a standard of care. Standard of care has a number of visits depending on the disease. So it's being able to reduce to that number of visits. And what we have seen is that we can significantly improve the patient experience in the journey of a clinical trial by more than 50%. We have also seen that in programs where we can reduce the number of visits, not only obviously helps that patient and sustainability for the planet to avoid all that traveling, it can also reduce the cost of the study. So we've seen some studies that can be between 20 to 40% lower cost by making sure that, enabling that different way to do things. And decentralization can also help with accelerating the clinical trial. So only 3% of eligible patients choose to enter a clinical trial because it's just impossible to mix with your usual life of being at work in certain diseases, and also to participate. So we see an increase, obviously, on participation if it's fully decentralized. Me and my family, we are currently participating in a clinical trial, but it's only because it's fully decentralized and we can do it from home at the moment. So otherwise, how could you fit it into your daily life as well? So we've seen tremendous benefits. And I do agree with Michelle that as we move away from very centric postcode driven, or I think you call it zip code in the US sites, and the vicinity of those patients, that we can hopefully have a lot more diverse clinical trials in future by having hybrid and decentralized clinical trials. So those are the examples from AstraZeneca that we can share.
Those are some impressive, groundbreaking results. I mean, 50% savings and acceleration. I'm very moved, right? Because technology has been around for quite some time. And Michelle, I think you put it best earlier, that it's not just putting, a paper process and adopting, it's really transforming. And so I think that's just so critical, right? We've learned lessons in our industry. We've learned the shift from site-centric to patient centricity. We've learned that by partnering with regulatory agencies to understand policies that can accelerate the adoption and the incentive. And just hearing those learnings is so incredible. And I'd love to turn it over to Dr. Sebastian Guth, where we recognize at Bayer there's a number of digital transformation initiatives happening, and certainly recognizing that COVID's changed the way sponsors are conducting digital and accelerating research. If you could share with us what might be happening at Bayer.
Absolutely. So first and foremost, good morning. Great to be here with every one of you. I mean, as you said, COVID in many ways moved and accelerated the transformation massively at Bayer, and I believe at most other companies. As I look back, at times it feels prior to the pandemic a bit like the race of the turtles. You know, we were talking about all these changes, and at the end we made, truth to be told, relatively little progress. And I think the last 18 months forced us to rethink, dramatically rethink and reshape the way we were doing trials. And the way I look at it is we started to actually bring trials to patients rather than bringing patients to trials. And that's a very fundamental shift. As I look at our experience, we have seen significant reductions, and Christina talked about this earlier. We've seen significant reductions in the number of physical visits that were required, for example, because we had to go back to the bare essentials. We've seen drops of physical visits of up to 80% and used technology and remote monitoring devices, telehealth approaches to compensate for what would have otherwise been a physical visit. We have, as Christina has reported as well, seen both the satisfaction of trialists and patients go up. And most importantly, we did not see a drop in the scientific standards or quality. And that's ultimately what matters. So I look at the past 18 months as a significant accelerant. I personally believe that the impact, particularly on research and development, may be the most profound as we move forward. And that's essentially what I take away from this experience.
Well, hopefully we're not turtles anymore, the race of the turtles. I'm not going to ask the panelists, is anyone surprised about the results? I mean, the results that Christina had mentioned, and just understanding that we're looking at each other to slowly take steps. Any comments or feedback on that?
And I think that, Dr. Califf raises such a good point, which is we need to be looking at this through the eyes of data and the real evidence. And I think the results that Christina, and what we're seeing kind of across the industry, there's a real impact. I mean, we know that when we transitioned the largest site network in the world from in-person screening for clinical trials to virtual on demand, the speed of enrollment went up by a factor of 3. But it also makes a ton of sense. So I think there's just so much low-hanging fruit around, what models will really help people be able to do this more easily. So I don't think the results actually are that surprising, but I think we need more evidence and more data to further optimize this in a big way. And I think we're really at the inception point of possibility. And we need to further refine the approaches with a more of a data-driven approach overall. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, what do you think, Tony?
Yeah, listen, I think the results Christina shared in particular are amazing, and I think the challenge is how do we make that the new baseline going forward, right? So if you were to step out of clinical research and lay out some of the interventions and some of the actions, you would expect those kind of results. If you make it easier for a patient to find what they're looking for, easier to sign up, you curate solutions and interventions really around them and the way they live their daily lives. In other parts of healthcare, certainly in the consumer space, it's exactly the kind of results we kind of consistently see. And I think the challenge is, obviously, how does technology, I think, help power that? From our perspective, it's also a big service component, right? So we've been building more of a community network for the last 20 years, and what we're looking to do is essentially overlay that curation of sort of services in the community together with technology to ultimately give you that kind of recurring possibility.
So it's not obvious to many, right, that, CVS, retail pharmacy, how does that work now with clinical trials?
I'm glad you asked.
Just curious, because the minds here, the beauty of live is that you can see eye contact. You can't always do it with Zoom, but so yeah, do tell.
Yeah, no, so listen, CVS has actually been in research for about 20 years. Most people wouldn't know it. Frankly, in our own company, they might not have known it. We have the largest home infusion business in the U.S., right? So we've done direct IP patient delivery for 15 years. And we've also had a real-world evidence business. But it was really about a year ago, and again, Michelle hit it, that COVID was really the catalyst for us. And frankly, we had sponsors come and say, guys, now's the time.
Yeah.
We thought about it for some time, but they said now is the time. Can you help us recruit patients for COVID trials and other trials? And can you work with us to really stand up really community-focused sites? So that's exactly what we did with our management team and board's approval. In COVID, we helped engage over 1 million patients. We expect that to go up to about 10 million more broadly as we engage patients directly in opportunities for clinical research. And I think the thing I'm most excited about is we've started to open up really community research sites. So we're up to about 15. We'll be at 40 by year end, hopefully about 150 next year. And the idea is, how do you really cut that distance between home and site and provide a convenient community location for the patients to access research? So I agree. I think technology alone is going to get us a good part of the way there. What we're excited about is tech plus a near-end set of services to really give patients, consumers, the kind of choices they'd be looking for.
It's really interesting. As I'm hearing you speak about this, it's like the convergence of life sciences and healthcare. They were once two separate places, right, for research, and now we're seeing that convergence slowly close in terms of identifying with the patient how that consumer-grade experience should be like. And so really excited about seeing and hearing more about what CVS is doing. I'm going to move over to Andy because of the fact of harnessing diversity and patient access. I know is near and dear to your heart, and just commenting on what Tony mentioned, love to hear what Takeda is doing to embark on this transformation journey.
Well, thanks. It's, I mean, just the nature of this conversation and the variability, the heterogeneity of people that you have here just speaks to the new world that we're living in. I actually am just going to reflect first on comments from Sebastian and Rob. The race of the turtles. We're also like this large ship that it has difficulty turning, and we're in a time when we're starting to pivot. And I wonder if we're being bold enough, really. And part of the problem that we face is, the randomized clinically controlled trial was one of the great inventions, really, of the 20th century, and it's really changed our ability to develop and to discover and develop drugs. But the reality is that the concept and the whole approach, with some exceptions to some statistical methodology, hasn't really changed in a century. It's still this really sluggish. I mean, it's brutal. I'm a physician and a scientist, and over my tenure in industry, I've become a devotee of the clinical trial. But it's brutal, it's inefficient, it's expensive, it's hard to find patients, and it's getting worse. It's getting more expensive and slower. And it drives me nuts, to be honest. And it's the greatest benefit, it's the greatest impediment that we have to innovation. And we're now at this precipice, following COVID, technology is there of implementing these new ways of working, but it's really slow. Standards don't exist. We have trouble coming together to implement these standards, and we're afraid. You start a study, you're not sure if the software is going to change from the beginning of the study till the end of the study, and whether you're going to have an endpoint that an agency will accept. In some cases, there are exploratory and pilot technologies out there. You don't know the reliability of these technologies. So it is a really difficult transition. And then, to your comments earlier, Rob, we're just not doing a good job at what we should be doing, which is studying our medicines in the diverse populations that are represented across the globe. And, I actually wasn't aware that things are getting worse with digitalization. I just knew that they were bad to begin with. And, it's not just decentralization that's obviously going to get us there. There's a constellation of forces that need to come together and intersect. We need greater diversity amongst the leadership of our industry and of the sectors that run clinical trials. I think that will be a major driver of diversification of clinical trials. And then we need to own it and step up and create bars for which we have to achieve. And then once we've set those bars, we need to accept the fact that in the short term, to enroll trials with the levels of diversity that we require, it's going to cost more money and it's going to take more time. And none of us want to do that. But it's inevitable that when you go through a change cycle, that's going to happen. But then once you've done that, once you've broken through, once you've started to implement the kinds of technologies that everybody in the panel here is talking about, there's going to be a period of more cost, less efficiency, but then we're rapidly going to get to a place where it's going to be much better for all of us.
Yeah, I know. It's interesting because it almost can be overwhelming when you think about all the changes, decentralization, data-driven, figuring out the digitalization. I'm going to also turn it back to Christina, if I may, where there's some real proof in results of starting, right? And it creates this opportunity of sharing best practices, collaboration. As a chief health officer, how are some of the things that you're addressing, Christina, to be able to look at that transformation? Just the number of studies. You mentioned 90 protocols using decentralized trials. You talked about some profound impact in terms of time and cost, and also about improving patient satisfaction. Are there things that you could share about lessons learned, maybe some partnerships and collaborations? What were some techniques or like golden nuggets you could share with many of us here in the room and maybe that are broadcasted that really would love to learn how to get started?
Well, thank you. Just one correction. So we are supporting, my team is supporting 90 programs. As I mentioned before, not all can be decentralized. So yeah, hybrid, 70% of that data can be collected from home, and the majority will be hybrid. So a massive reduction of the visits, but decentralization, there needs to be a specificity for being fully decentralized. So how do you move from a few pilots to scale? So how do you move the organization from, because you have the believers that run a specific study, those individuals in teams that really want to try that, while others would not want to touch it because they have not had their experience. And as Andy was mentioning, obviously they have 20 years of doing it in a different way that gives them that sense of, I know that it will work, so why would I try to change it? So what we did is a lot of sharing. So we have sharing websites where we have evaluated devices and companies, and we tell teams, these are the ones that you shouldn't touch, these are the ones that we have piloted, these ones the ones that we had a success study, this one is the one. So it's similar to when you're buying something, you have a reference in terms of that knowledge across the company. And to be fair, as a joint leadership team, the CEO of the company and the leadership team, we discussed it through the pandemic in terms of whether this one should be the new normal. So the goal for this year was to say, well, 90% of new programs should review it and evaluate it, and if it's valid, then put it in. So it was also a bold ambition in terms of moving the whole organization. And we had obviously a common goals to improve that patient experience in the clinical trial, also as a goal across the company that
Okay.
so what are you trying to achieve? Make sure that we do have a much better patient experience, and then obviously the quality and everything else comes with it as well, but it's how to move the whole organization with common goals so that everyone is rowing in the same direction versus having a separate team with different goals than everybody else. So that common ambition, I believe, is critical. And it's not only that. I think beyond what we are doing today, I think there are tremendous opportunities, and I hope that we can discuss it as part of the panel as well in terms of what is then possible then subsequently. So once you scale it, then what do we believe what will happen next? But probably we'll discuss that in a second.
Yeah. I think the scalability is exciting. I think also just hearing some of the opportunities for diversity and access. And, Tony, I think, just understanding where we think about the future of what we're modernizing for, now patients have choice, right? Where they're either consented, consented a trial, engaged, determining their visits, whether they're going to be, in clinic, and possibly opportunities where it could be remote or local, right? And so what are the things that you're feeling will be changing the paradigm as pharma companies are looking through this transformation? They're embarking in areas of digital, decentralized. What are some of the collaborations you're seeing with pharma in this regard?
Yeah, I'd say if you go upstream, we're also been focused on just increasing awareness and ease of access into a trial, right? We surveyed our own consumers, 90% wanted to hear about trials, and as we engage even that first million, almost all had never actually been reached out to before. And when you ask and when you create the right communication channels, you find really interesting insights. So diverse patients were actually more likely to want to know about COVID trials, right, than the standard population that we'd otherwise sort of sampled. So I think a big focus first upstream is how do we work with partners, at least for us, to really dramatically increase customer awareness, right, and ease of entry into the trial. That could be going directly to the consumer. We're talking to employers. How do we bring awareness of research into sort of employee health benefits as part of the standard package that you might get? We're working with physicians. I mean, there's still a real challenge of getting the right information to the doctor at the right time in their workflow with the right compensation method. And so we're piloting some programs there to really cut the distance from consumer, to ultimately the kind of treating physicians. And part of our thesis is, again, there's a lot of opportunity simply to create the right information and make it part of the healthcare journey that consumers have. And that's probably the big insight we're seeing as we work with sponsors as well. And that's sort of, I think, a big opportunity really for all of us. I think when you get into the community, again, we've had technology alone is incredible in what it can do and the kind of outcomes it can deliver. But how do you create the right integrated ecosystem, to ultimately give consumers the curated set of choices they want? They don't want to know that you used a home health vendor over here, a CVS over there, and a traditional site network over there. They need a set of experiences that matches the expectations they really have. So for us, that's going to be working closely with technology partners. It's going to be working closely with academic systems and site networks, right? Ultimately, the way to make this happen is to create that integrated ecosystem. And I think there's one lesson for us is no one can do it on their own, but all of us are going to have to act differently if we expect different outcomes. Doing it the same way we've done it obviously won't get us there.
Yeah. I can tell you that, the world is watching, right? Like clinical trials has become mainstream topics at dinner conversations during the pandemic. And now we've been had this opportunity where we're driving the what if. What's the possibility of using decentralized trials? Access, care, convenience, right? And recognizing that we're also, what happened during the pandemic was also these economic pressures of, in addition to understanding equality, right? And let's talk about diversity next, right? I think diversity is such an important topic. We're talking about convenience and care. Michelle, tell us about this research for everybody and every biology. Where's Medable heading in terms of being able to attack some of these other problems in addition to efficiency, but also diversity?
Sure. So, of course, I think many people in the room are aware of the limited scope of much of the trial data in terms of who are the patient populations who are really represented in clinical trials. And I think what the future holds is not only that data is more representative and is much more reflective of the populations who are living with these conditions, but really importantly that those people are the ones who have access at an earlier phase so that people can potentially benefit from these therapies in the research phase as well. So this is not easy. I don't think anyone has the answers right now. With that said, the more we focus on things that really move the needle, how do we actually enable treating physicians with whom people have a relationship and trust to be a gateway for better access to clinical trials? I think one of the things that stands out to me as a practicing physician is there is no part of our training that talks about how to ensure someone has access to clinical research. I mean, I trained at Stanford, one of the leading research organizations in the world, and there was no standard part of the training that's like, okay, we're going to talk to the patient about the options for psoriasis. Never on that list is, let's talk about what's at the cutting edge, what is in research. And I think that, one of the biggest opportunities is to really get into communities and be a trusted partner through trusted access points, such as community pharmacies, such as treating physicians. I think we need to look at where those trust points exist, and we need to be aware that, people they engage in clinical research to better their own health, and what are the trusted resources for healthcare that really at this point are not an access point for clinical research. I think that's a critical strategy. I also think we need to continue to really focus on education. We need to talk about why research matters and all of the efforts we make to ensure that it's safe. I think about, there's this incredible New England Journal of Medicine article looking at the incidence of smoking and smoking cessation. And it absolutely directly tracks to public awareness investments and why stopping smoking matters. And the things we talk about, the education campaigns, ensuring that everyone has access to the true and accurate information about clinical research and all of the things we do to make it safe and why it matters and save lives, I think is, it's not anything that any one company will own or necessarily directly profit from, but I think education is one of the most important things we can do to help solve this and to really improve diversity in clinical research.
Yeah, so it's convenience, it's ease of use, it's access, it's trust, right? I mean, those are the things we were talking about, right? And I think we've come full circle, right? Where during the pandemic, we had to embrace decentralized trials. We've been able to embrace collaborations and partnerships. And now we're looking at the fact that patients are asking for, 98%, right, said they were satisfied with telemedicine. We heard some of these retention rates of 90% and 200% faster enrollment. And now we're going into this a barrier that we're breaking for diversity. What would be really interesting to hear from those from our sponsors is that here you also have this opportunity with decentralized because of the Century 21 Cure Act is also looking at how we can personalize medicine and how we're trying to now establish an opportunity where we're now creating a wider opportunity for clinical research across a wider population to now target therapies. And so maybe Dr. Sebastian Guth, you could talk about how you're seeing some of this personalization coming in from clinical to commercial.
Absolutely, Marianne. If I go back, though, for a moment, and that builds on something that Andy said earlier, at the end of the day, at least in my mind, technology needs to serve a purpose. And the purpose at the end here is to really improve the science and to use technology to help us improve outcomes, prolong life, see patients benefit of substantially better quality of life. So we see three major opportunities as I look at our company. We see the opportunity to leverage technology, as I just said, to become better at what we do. And decentralized clinical trials are a prime example, leveraging real-world data to understand how patients do not just in a controlled clinical trial setting, but in real life is an element that is of great importance to us. Creating those seamless experiences for patients, all of that is at the core of at least our transformation. The second piece that we're very focused on is using technology to augment the work of physicians. And we have an example of an algorithm in CTEPH, chronic thromboembolic pulmonary hypertension, which we're developing under the guidance of the FDA to ultimately help clinicians become significantly better at diagnosing CTEPH and with that contributing to the health and well-being of those patients. So we see massive opportunities in that space. And then third, we believe that technology in itself can provide new avenues to ultimately treat certain disease states and diseases. So moving away from chemistry, essentially, as a way to treat a disease to instead leveraging technology. And we as a company work and focus on all three areas and are excited with the opportunities that brings. Importantly, though, what drives us is ultimately to benefit patients and improve the science, and that's what we're best at.
Excellent, excellent. So I might actually ask questions from the audience, so those that are here. Just thinking about, we have discussed this exciting transformation where we've embarked together as an industry, the race of the turtles, but being able to adopt some groundbreaking results on access, diversity, improving patient satisfaction, creating a clinical as a care where we're trying transformation. For those of you in the room, maybe like a show of hands, who's actually tried decentralized trials, just like a poll? And for those of you that raised your hand, if someone could either share their experience or even ask a question in terms of how has the decentralized adoption either improved some efficiencies for your organization or may have changed the way you may be partnering or collaborating? Anyone want to share? Yeah.
But my question would be, how are you measuring patient set? So I think from AstraZeneca, you said it's increased by 50% your patient experience. How do you measure that?
Excellent question. So the question, I'll just repeat it for those that, so thank you for sharing that. The question was, how are we measuring patient satisfaction and experience, right? And so we covered diversity, access, but Michelle, maybe if you want to take a shot at that one?
Sure, and I think it would be great to hear from Christina as well. You know, I think in the pandemic, we had a unique opportunity to actually transition some studies that were not using these methodologies to using these methodologies. And we probably would never have had, you know, a comparative data set that would be as, you know, probably as strong. And what we saw there was extremely compelling in terms of patient retention prior to using these methodologies being, you know, in some cases 30% lower than when we transitioned. And this was actually leading to, in some cases, patient retention rates of, you know, north of 90%. And to me, that was one of the most powerful kind of data sets that we could look at. Now, you know, with integrated technologies, we can, of course, look at patient retention in a real-time basis. We can actually also ask patients, you know, in a pretty lightweight way through these technologies what their experience is. But ultimately, you know, I believe that retention is probably, retention and speed of enrollment, right? Speed of enrollment is, does this work for my life? In theory, retention is the measure of how it really works for someone's life. So those are two data points that we track, you know, and continue to really optimize our technology for. I think that that's really where we're going to see a lot of the improvements that this approach brings. With that said, you know, no one has a silver bullet today, but it's about evolving the science and technology to optimize for a state that we believe, you know, is achievable through that work. I love this, Christina, when you think about AstraZeneca has done such a phenomenal job at really building a model around patients and serving patients. It would be really interesting to hear, you know, when you look at that data, like where is that coming from?
Yeah, so it obviously depends on what patient experience we're trying to measure. So obviously there is the patient experience with the treatment and how the quality of life of a patient with that treatment. There is also the patient experience on participating in a clinical trial. And obviously it's better to have an actual, you know, how was your actual experience? But that's a lagging indicator in terms of you've run the study, they had their experience, they maybe have dropped out or not dropped out or retained. And this is a lagging indicator. So to move the organization, we tried to create a leading indicator. So when they were designing the study or the protocol, could they get a quick indicator, like in seconds, to say, based on thousands of service to patients in what the burden of visits, procedures, and comparing this new protocol with similar indication protocols, how does that experience compare? Indicator is not an actual, but it's an indication. And we use as a super data scientist that we have he used to work for NASA. So then every single program could get that leading indicator as they were designing this study. And if it was worse than before, what they could do to improve it. So that's how we move the organization with some leading indicators. Obviously, we need to prove the truth of the pudding as we go into actuals, but it makes people change. You know, having it at the end, you know, it's difficult for teams to change behavior as they are designing it. So that's what we've been doing at AstraZeneca to move the design to be a lot more patient-centric. I hope that helps.
It does. You know, at Medable, we have a patient advisory network, and I interviewed a patient and asked the experience on decentralized trials, and the comment was, look, you know, I've opened my door, right? You're now in my home. We're now creating this intimate relationship where you have created such convenience. I no longer have to ask my parents to drive me. I can allow them to focus on treating me, right, in my condition. You've been able to hear me and my voice in terms of what I want to be consented on and how I want to be engaged. And I want to actually give more information, right? And so there's this openness of being able to have that relationship, and it's like this partnership with patients. Right? And so we talk about how do you measure patient experience? Well, there's a quantitative way, and there's also a qualitative way. And that qualitative way is really trying to figure out how do we create new convenience, new care? How do we ensure the retention and enrollment? And how do we also figure out aspects that are going to help either eradicate diseases or identify how we can actually predict, right? And that predictive intelligence. And so I think it's just an exciting movement that we're all in. Every one of you here today that's in attendance, you're having some part and shape of transforming clinical research. When we hear the voice of the patient and being able to impress upon how we design studies, a human-centered design, making sure it's elegant and easy to access and understand, and also to understand how decentralized trials is now more than just clinical research, right? It's around being able to create research for everybody. And
Marianne, this is Rob. I'd like to,
yeah.
if I may, just say a few words in favor of the tortoise. I think people may have forgotten that there's a parable called The Tortoise and the Hare. The hare didn't necessarily win in the end. And so there's a list of things that I just want to put out there for people to think about that I think should be of some interest and concern as we go through this. And I don't want my comments to in any way say I'm not in favor of almost everything that's been discussed here. We should be patient-centered in design. We should be giving people access at home. But there are a lot of issues involved here, and I hope this next phase will be a phase of really serious study of the science of clinical research. You know, if we look historically, one reason that medicines are so good, and that is Dr. Rosenblatt said earlier this morning, vaccines are saving the world, is that the industry and the regulators have pretty much worked together to really have a scientific agenda. So a lot of, you know, for example, if we look at retention, you know, one of my favorite things about Silicon Valley, you know, I deal with a company that deals with about 4 billion people in an average month. But if you look at who follows up in things, the people that are digitally active are very different than the people who are not digitally active. And so if we only look at the people who were retained or who signed up and followed through, we get a very skewed view of what the reality is. And we're going to have to take that into account. Andy made a comment about clinical trials being stuck in cement. And, you know, I'll just make a comment there. The early clinical trials were actually the opposite. Remember that the first major clinical trial was a cluster randomized trial of states with the polio vaccine that literally enrolled millions of children in a very short period of time. And then we had the era of the large sample trial, the ISIS type trial, where, I sort of hate to admit it now, I'm old enough to have been part of all that, but we enrolled tens of thousands of people in their local centers very quickly in that era. But along the way, we sort of forgot the essentials of clinical trials. It added on a bunch of stuff that's entirely unnecessary and not helpful in most kinds of clinical trials. So I kind of feel like it's not that we're inventing something new. We're sort of going back to what was known before, but now with the addition of technology. But to really understand what works, we're going to have to study it dispassionately, which I think has been a real hallmark of the industry as it develops drugs. There's a reason that 90% of the drugs don't get on the market, and it's because you actually have to show they're safe and effective before you get on the market. I also want to comment, I thought there was a good discussion, but I just want to reemphasize the role of the clinician in all this. As long as we keep the clinical trials world separate from the clinical world, we'll never achieve the learning health system that I think many of us yearn for. And, you know, I applaud what CVS had to say, and I know that there's work being done to integrate the pharmacy with the clinician in the local environment. I want to put in a plea, and Andy, I think I understood what you said, but I just want to make a plea that randomization is still one of the best tools that God gave us to sort out what's effective from what's not. And if we didn't believe that, just look at the COVID era with all of the ridiculous claims that have been made about drugs based on looking at databases that turned out to be entirely incorrect when they were properly studied. And so while there are a lot of cases where observational studies and large cohorts are critically important. To make a valid inference about causality, most of the time we're going to need to use randomization, so that's got to be built into it. And then the last thing I wanted to comment on, I'm still not sure what to make of this. I think it's a good thing that the clinical trial has gone from something that people need to be protected from to something that people should look forward to because it's an avenue to better care. But as we started up clinicaltrials.gov, and I was very involved in the startup of that, one of the things that you see is that not all clinical trials are good for people. And there are a lot of people trying to make money on clinical trials who are not necessarily looking out for the patient. And so somewhere in here, we have to strike a balance between telling the public that a clinical trial is a wonderful thing, which I believe it is when it's well done and proper, and the fact that there is a history of exploitation of people in research from which they need to be protected. And I don't think we're at the right balance now. I like the direction that's moving in general, but all of these things are reasons why the tortoises of the world need to still be in business, need to be looking at the hares and saying, wait a minute, maybe you're going a little too fast. Maybe you need to stop and reflect on what you're doing and study it. So thanks for giving me a chance to vent my spleen a little bit about some of these issues.
Always appreciate Dr. Caleb. I mean, look, at the end of the day, clinical trials save lives. We're here today, right? Because of the medicine collaboration partnership, ingenuity of thinking about ways of ensuring, to your point, the efficacy and safety is of primary importance, ensuring that we have better insights, hopefully earlier insights, predictive insights, the ability to understand with those insights, how could we have changed something in the clinical study, how it could be more adaptive, more inclusive. In addition, we are thinking about ways that makes that patients stay in that trial longer because we believe we can give value. And so I think this is just the radical thinking that can't be done overnight, but it can start at steps at a time. Yeah. So I just applaud some of the bold thinking. I applaud some of the fact that we embrace. And so I really thank the community for leaning in with us because we can't do this alone, right? And it's through partnerships.
One thing I just want to comment on, because I think, I absolutely agree with Dr. Caleb. It's about two things. It's about science and safety. That's the core of the clinical research process. I also think, though, that if you pressure test that, speed is an important variable. And not that you should ever compromise science and safety for speed, but we should also optimize for speed. And the reason is that an effective therapy has a greater net benefit when you take the speed factor into account. Yeah. So, and I think that really the way I would interpret in part what Andy was saying about the tortoise is I agree with Dr. Califf if the tortoise is a representation of the science, but I think what we've seen in the last year is that actually we don't have to take a tortoise approach to have phenomenal science, but you can never ever compromise the phenomenal science. But we also need to understand the benefit of speed to the world who's waiting for these therapies. And when you look at every day, the number of lives that are saved by the speed with which we got the vaccinations into the world, I do think that the equation of clinical research should not just be science and safety. I think that the third variable should be speed. And when we don't compromise the other two, and we can also optimize for speed, there's actually synergies you get from science and safety when taking speed into consideration and challenging the way we're currently conducting the science. So,
I think that was well said, but I do want to emphasize speed is a third variable. And if we look at the COVID era, 90% of the trials that were initiated quickly turned out to be useless. So the way you said it is absolutely correct, and I completely agree. But we also have to just keep emphasizing those first two elements are essential.
If I may, I love being on a panel, as with most of them that I sit on, where I learn more than I contribute, and there's just so much. And Rob, to your comment about the God-given gift of the RCT, amen. I did a top 10 of list of the greatest healthcare innovations in the 20th century, and the RCT was in my top 10 list, and it continues to be a driver of how we develop new medicines. I will say that I agree with everything that's said, and speed has to be a part of what we do. We can't be stupid how we run trials like 90%. But speed becomes a very important. It's not just important for bringing medicines to patients, but for the competitiveness of our products. Look at oncology, for example. Anytime you jump on a mechanism, there's 5 to 10 other companies that are doing exactly the same thing. So speed is, unfortunately or fortunately, a really critical part of our game. The one comment I'll make is, diversity is not just about, as we're all talking about, decentralization does not equal diversity, right? It's a component of diversity, and education is so critical, as you've mentioned, Christina. But there's so many parts about it. There's one piece I'll just say, which is for all of us to listen and to learn from patients, which is something that for many years we didn't do. In fact, I remember when I joined the industry, which was in 2001, was old then, and I'm even older now, but in 2001, we would argue, who is our customer in R&D? If you're in research, is development your customer? If you're in development, is commercial your customer? Is the regulator your customer? Is the physician your customer? Is the payer your customer? No one ever thought the patient was the customer.
Yeah,
and I think that's changed. The patient voice has become what it should be. It's the driver of what we do. And I think as we start to listen more and more to patients, our ability to enroll these trials is going to get easier and easier. And therefore, we'll go faster and faster and diversify and diversify.
And Andy, maybe just a quick build. At the end, at least in my mind, this notion of trust that Tony also talked about is just incredibly important. And technology, in my mind, cannot replace the trust that is required to ultimately see a greater participation in clinical trials. And the proximity that you, Tony, talked about earlier is one element that I see as critically important. And the second piece, exactly to what Rob spoke about, is ultimately the quality of the science. We cannot compromise the quality of the science, because that's essentially the foundation of what we as an industry operate on. That's what patients trust us for.
Yeah. I think we want to make a pledge that we're not going to go back to traditional ways, but we are going to learn on how we can calibrate that using some of these newer methods. I see a question in the audience, if I may.
I love listening to Bob Califf. Hi, I'm Sam Waxel. I actually probably disagree with half of, 3/4 of what I've heard, because the beauty of the sort of touchy-feely part of what we hear has nothing to do with real clinical trials, and I think the randomized clinical trials taught us that. In real diseases that are tough, the FDA doesn't care about half of what you've said. They want a clinical endpoint which they can measure and that you have to prove. It is not easy to do all of the things that we talk about from a diversity point of view, from the point of view of inclusion of people in one part of the country versus another. One is looking at trying to enroll for getting science right and getting clinical data. And I also believe that while the inflection point of COVID has changed things, I don't know whether 5 years from now we'll remember all of that. We didn't remember all of that 100 years ago when we had the great influenza. 5 years later, the Roaring '20s changed the world again. We may not have that this time because of technology, but there will be a reversion to some mean. And I really believe that all of the discussion about what someone feels or what someone likes or what someone will be, how we'll include everyone in a clinical trial is tougher than we say. And in the end, the agency, the regulatory authorities have to agree on what an endpoint is, and that's what's going to be important. So when we talk about all this other stuff, it's really pretty and it's really sweet. It's like, some venture capitalist telling me I have to be disruptive. I don't know what that means. I know I have to be innovative. I know I have to do new things. This disruptive stuff, to me, is total bullshit. And so, you know, I have to tell you, when I think about doing clinical work, and I do it all the time, I think about it very carefully, and I think about endpoints. And so Bob Califf was, you know, today like slowing us down, but he was being really nice. I'm not as nice as he is, and don't need to be. So therefore,
Rob, Tim, I got to say, what I heard is that you agreed with 25% of what we said. So that's great. That's great. But you know, listen. The reality is that it's incumbent on us. It's incumbent on us to do the things that you say are hard. We have to step up and do it. And sure, endpoints are the most important thing. But if you're generating endpoints in populations that don't represent the diversity of the diseases that we're treating, they may not be relevant.
I will say, I will say that this has just been an extraordinary panel of just viewpoints, and thank you for the participation in the audience, because what we're doing is not easy. We recognize.
Can I just point out one thing though? Like, I think this is a really critical perspective, as is Bob's, and the reason is, you know, that we can't hype this.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, and I think people tend to do that. We cannot hype this. The science is the most important part of this, the science and the safety. At the same time, if we don't push ourselves to think of a better and more innovative way to do things, we'll also never actually change. But I think your point is a really great one, which is, you know, this is not about hype, this is about people's lives and a scientific process that is critical to advancing those lives. But I think that, you know, we still must push ourselves to serve a broader set of patients. We must evolve the endpoints. When you look at the approval of the drugs for HIV, it wasn't until we evolved the endpoint to be viral load that timeline for that drug approval went down from years to months. So the endpoints matter, but these are also areas we need to pressure test ourselves in our thinking and our methodologies. Sure, absolutely.
They're part of the partnerships. So I want to thank the participation. Provocative thinking is what we want, but thank you so much.